Ron, first and foremost, thanks so much for inviting me here. It is great to be here in the great state of North Carolina talking about the Sierra Sounds. Let's get the full picture for everybody. Can you take us back to what these guys were experiencing up there and how you got involved in the camp?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, it started for me in 1971. I was involved with some hunters. They came out with a story about these things coming around the camp. This is in the Sierra Nevada mountains between Lake Tahoe and Yosemite. The two brothers had gone up that summer into this camp, which is about 8,400 feet in elevation and 8 miles into the wilderness, very remote area. But that's where they got their deer. The hunting camp had been since 1958 for the Johnson brothers. And they came out with this story that there was something besides bear messing with them up there at night. They went out when the commotion was over with and saw these huge tracks in the mud there. Donald wouldn't go back by himself. He invited me to go back with him just because he didn't like what happened at all. He didn't know where to put that in his paradigm. His religion said that giants don't exist anymore. They're just in the Bible and somewhere like that. And I went back up. The guys were okay. So we went out. I started going back as often as I could to get somebody to go with me. Did that in 1971 several times. I don't remember how many times, but we all started taking tape recorders up there and started recording them. In the winter of 1972, Warren Johnson, the leader of our group, he wrote Ivan Sanderson, cryptozoologist. Ivan Sanderson thought he was probably having his leg pulled or something, so he contacted Peter Burns and said, I don't know if there's anything to this or not, but he thought it was a hoax. Peter read the 23-page letter from Warren. He thought it was a hoax also. However, because that don't happen, or have repeated visits like that. Anyway, Peter knew a man named Al Berry who worked for a Record Searchlight newspaper in Redding, California. Told Al if he wanted to go down and check it out, he could, but it's too far away for him to go down there just to see if it was good or not. Al actually thinking the same thing, and I didn't know all this until later years when I seen the correspondence between them all. Al came down, interviewed us all, and asked if he could go up. And so in 1972, when we could get back in, Warren Johnson took him back in. And we all started going back, and he started experiencing the same thing. He was trying to find out who could be pulling our leg way back in the middle of nowhere, leaving no signs except for their tracks and sounds they recorded. Al Berry was recording also. We were all recording, so we had a lot of redundancy in the sounds. This went on from 71, actually, all the way through 76. Repeated visits, not every time, but many times in 72, 74, right in there. And it wasn't until 74 when I actually saw one. Very elusive, they're very fast. I was recording at the same time, so therefore I got to see what made the sounds. They say if you don't see what made the sound, you don't know what made the sound. He's being accused of all kinds of things. Al Berry, he's the one that got approached. He's the one that's trying to go out and try to solicit some professional to study the sounds. He went to Philip Lieberman at Brown University first, and Philip thought he was a former student trying to make fun of him or something, and he's a cognitive researcher and says that no, he wouldn't do it. Al finally found Professor Kirlin at the University of Wyoming who took him on unbiasedly. Al just he wanted to get a professional behind it and say it's either fake or it's real. Dr. Kirlin did a year-long study, gave his report at the University of British Columbia in 1976, I think it was. He wrote it in a paper that was posted in a book, A Man Like Monsters on Trial, from 1980, UCB Press. Anybody wanted to see that would have to get that book and read the paper. He concluded, after a year-long study, there was no foul making. It was all legitimate stuff. It hadn't been slowed down, speeded up. There was no 60-cycle hum in it. There was nothing else. It was legitimate, real. And he said one clip of it represented an animal 8 foot tall. 8'2", I think he said, something like it, compared to the human vocal mechanism. So that kind of put it up there, but not enough for academia, because I still think it's an ape in the woods, right? And we all did too at the time. Didn't realize just how significant all this was until modern times. We all started looking around up there while we was there. Al did too, still trying to figure out how anybody could do this. That was before Kirlin said it was above the human range, and a lot of it was anyway. We started going out and talking about it after that in different conferences and places all over the United States, actually, but still couldn't answer the odyssey that went with it. There were some strange things went on up there besides the vocalizations, strange lights, strange sounds that wasn't language at all. It was like I talk about this in my first book, Voices in the Wilderness, but there's more to it. There's just more to it. We're still looking how an ape could do this. We didn't realize that only humans have the vocal mechanism for spoken language like I'm doing now. That was revealed in actually Philip Lieberman's paper. He says only humans have the cognitive ability to speak, like with morphine streams. It wasn't until 2008 till a cryptolinguist who was trained by the Navy as a cryptolinguist spent his career in the Navy deciphering, transcribing foreign sounds, either codes or language, and determined if it was a language. He got a hold of the sounds by accident and came out and interviewed me and Al Berry both, got the context behind the sounds, asked if we could study them. We let him. He came back and says, this is a spoken language by the human definition of language. It means a morphine stream of words. It means cognitive ability, like we're talking now. And no other animal, supposedly, not a whale, not a dolphin, nothing has that ability except us as humans. That's established by Philip Lieberman, actually. And he said that only humans have that vocal mechanism that's a hyoid bone with the tongue and the nervous system into the brain to say an innumerable amount of words. So that put it over the edge for me right there. If that's the case, you got those 3 bullet points. You got Dr. Kirlin saying it's out the human range outside. You got Scott Nelson, the cryptolinguist, who says it's a spoken language. Then you got Dr. Philip Lieberman says it's only humans have that, so it has to have a human component, and that's where I go with it. I didn't really realize all that until years later when I got all this information together from my studies. So it's really put me on a hunt for how they did what they did, because they did some really strange things and had some really strange things go on up there. So I got out of the Newtonian physics, which we're all raised in, which 1687, we know things are all fall. You can measure the fall. You can measure anything. It's all predictable. It's what we live in, our third-dimensional environment. So that's how it got started for me, and it got me on a kind of a worldwide wind to check other countries out and see what's going on with them.
Let's talk a little bit about your sighting when you got to see these things, because that's one of the things I did was get some questions from the audience. And that was one of the questions that the audience had was, did you or any of the other guys that were up there see what you were interacting with? Clearly you did that. Can you talk a little bit about that, set up the scene for us and talk about what you saw and what you experienced?
Sure. It was the night I recorded the Samurai Cry, they call it. It was 1974. Bill and I, he was our packer, we just got into camp, and these things were at the camp when we got there, so they obviously knew where we were going, and we put that all together from other signs we saw on the way in. Just before it was dusk, but not dark. We heard the pounding, the cracking on rocks, the coding they give with whooping sounds, and we knew we was in for it then, but we're still outside the shelter. Normally they wouldn't interact with us until we were inside the shelter we had, which was a group of trees that grew in a circle. We wrapped cables around it. I didn't, but it was done before I went up there. Put plastic over the top of it so that it gets you out of the weather, and deadfall leaning up against the cables. Anyway, they started messing with us, chattering, stuff like that. I say messing with us because that's what they do. They mess with you. I think that they know more about the woods than we do. They do. It was an exciting night, and when I heard that thing, well, we was hearing 2 of them chatter. We think it's 2, an adolescent and a female down below by the creek, and then behind us was the Samurai Cry goes on, and actually Matt Moneymaker, he coined that when he first heard these sounds in 95, I think it was. That night was a big night. I saw this thing shoot down through the trees. Could not give you any definition on it, but it was fast. It was bipedal, and it was very smooth, very fast. That's the first and only glimpse I've ever got of one that I know of. Other people, my daughter saw them 3 times up there, but there's something about got to watch out if you bring a young lady, pretty one in there, because the young ones out there, and they crossbreed, I believe, with indigenous people. It's also the Native American lore as they are crossbreeding. I think some of them are a little more human-like than others, and some of them may have different abilities than others. I get into how they did what they did because it didn't make sense. The Newtonian world that we live in, which is 3-dimensional environment, I get reports on these things. They saw them disappear, and it has to be a scientific answer. Al Berry, the guy we took in there in 72, and I became friends with him after that, and we started talking about it. He said, don't talk about the strange stuff because you lose people with that stuff, because people can't understand anything outside of what they can see, feel, and touch, and anything material or physical and predictable. Everything we know of is that way, but that's not true. There's a whole other science out there called quantum science, and it's an acknowledged science, but it's out of our being able to prove it because it's out of our sight. You can't see it ever. But that got me into quantum science and trying to understand the enigmas associated with these beings. I think I've got a lot of the answers put together in my head anyway. I don't know if anyone else wants to agree with it, but I just encourage people to look into that because it rides on the back of our Newtonian physics of everything, which is 1687. Quantum science wasn't even established until Max Planck got the Nobel Prize in 1918 for it. Physicists like Einstein have been studying today. You got theoretical physicists, so they've got to be called theoretical because you can't see it. It's like our cell phones. You don't see how that works, but it works. A lot of other things work on the back of quantum science. In fact, Dr. Christopher Pereira at West Texas A&M says everything from the atom through the cosmos works on the laws of quantum physics. It's just things are out there that we don't see, that we don't understand yet. That's because of who we are as humans. We're born into with this restriction. We only go into this environment, this third-dimensional density. We only see within 430 and 770 terahertz. That's our frequency. Everything. Say one more time. Everything is energy, frequency, and vibration. If you don't find the vibration of something, that's where you get into everything, how things change. Because you can find the vibration of anything, you can change its matter, according to quantum physics. How does matter change into energy? That was proven by CERN in 2012 when the Hadron Collider made energy out of a particle. They've learned how to do a lot of things, and they're learning more and more all the time. And I just want to ride the wagon with them and try to learn more because there's some strange things going on up there. How do they disappear? That's been told. Everybody just shoves them off. How nothing can disappear. They say it ain't there. Not true. You got Dr. Paul Dirac at the Nobel Prize in 1933 for substantiating antimatter, he called it. Because there's antimatter and there's matter. That's the direct change between energy and matter. Matter and energy are interchangeable. Hands down, that's been established now. Mathematically it was established, but it's also established by CERN. Get into that and you think if they could find the frequency of their matter, they could change into energy. Now, a lot of people don't want to go with that, but it can happen. If they can change their matter and energy, they'd go out of our visual perception. We only see within the frequency of 130 to 770 terahertz. That pretty much put that one out of most people's reach, but a lot of people who want to follow that would understand that's possible. But they got to reach the frequency. All these vocalizations we had up there, which are outside the human range, a lot of we don't know how high because our little cassette recorders wouldn't do that. They wouldn't tell you everything. So that's all we had in those days. Reel to reel, but we never took reel to reel up there, just too much for the mules, our saddlebags. So anyway, it was quite an adventure and still is. I don't know if I'll ever get to the bottom of it until one of these things comes out of the woods and says hi, tells us what they're saying, but they were trying to say something to me that night in 74. I was fortunate enough to get my cassette recorder out of the saddlebag and turn it on.
I'm glad you mentioned the setup and what you guys were using. That's one of the first questions that I had because I work with sound all the time. I'm a content creator. I do podcasts, so I'm constantly listening to sounds. And what is out there in the zeitgeist as far as the Sierra sounds, a couple of times I've heard them and it sounds like you guys are in the shelter and there's times when these creatures are vocalizing. Can you talk a little bit about how you did that? Because I've heard it other places. Like I know you can Google it now and there's like a 4-minute thing on YouTube, and it sounds almost in some of those clips that you guys are in the same place with these creatures. Can you paint the picture for me and the audience about how this was done? Were you guys recording from inside your shelter, or did you have recorders outside where they were closer to the creatures? How did that work as far as the setup?
Okay, in 71, 72, 73, 74, well, not 74, but those years, we had the microphone set in the cracks of the shelter, and the recorders were next to our sleeping bags where we were laying. They usually, when it was outside by the stove, which we'd carried in and put together on mules, we'd wait till we heard a big crack or a sound of some type, because it's very distinctive, very decisive when you hear it. It's not like some bear or some deer stepping on something. It's heavy. That's the time we thought, let's go in, because we leave food out for them, generally, and they'd take it, generally. Once we was inside the shelter, we could turn the tape recorders on or off. The night that Al Berry got those very clear ones, which were my first CD I produced, Jonathan Frakes narrates it. It's integrated with the sounds that he was recording that night. We were all recording, but he got the very best ones. He had it remoted up about 40 feet from the shelter behind our shelter. And it was on a little pine tree. Actually, I had it turned upside down because it was a stereo recorder, but we didn't know that at the time when you taped the microphone to the tree. One of them was right behind one of those big trees up there, he thinks. Either that or behind a big rock outcropping. I had some very unique recordings from several other times that I lost in a house fire. Unfortunately, I had my stereo microphone set up. I had a little portable D-cell battery. It was operated on stereo, so it was a little bigger than a cassette, but I could haul it in. I lost all those in the fire. Fortunately, one of them that I had, I'd sent off after I got back to the 74 recording. I sent it to Al Berry, so I had a copy of it. I didn't lose that one. Bill McDowell, who was with me, also recording, but he transfers his onto reel-to-reel when he gets home and reuses them again. By the way, if you're out there listening to this, don't do that. If you record it once, leave it alone. Get it studied or see what's going on with it, because once you screw with them, you can't get forensic study done on them. I had quite a few recordings that I wish I still had, but I don't. Produced the second CD from the copy that Al Berry had of mine. They sounded so different in 74 when we was recording when they were outside. They were actually yelling something at me, and I'd yell back, trying to mimic them, still thinking I'm talking to an ape out there. I can't talk, but whatever they're doing, I'm going to try to duplicate it. And that's what I was trying to do. But if I'd have known then what I think I know now, I would do things differently, because they're sentient beings. At least what we were dealing with up there. I got to say that very clearly. What we were dealing up there, I don't think all of them are that way. Some of them can. I think some of them have crossbred so many eons of time with indigenous people that some of them have lost the attribute maybe of speaking. I don't know. I just know that the Patterson track, I think that was a hybrid, definitely a hybrid of a lot of years of crossbreeding, because their tracks in the Patterson track way, which I have one, are so different than ours. But it's different in the way that there's not the arch that's in the Patterson track. There's not the angle of the toes like the Patterson track. All ours are just even right across the top. That's over years of being up there seeing tracks. I just think that there's different ones, and some of them have different attributes than others. And that gets us into way back history. Because I was raised religiously. I have a pretty good knowledge of biblical scriptures and stuff. So I was originally trying to find out where giants came from, what happened to them. But then I had to get into Mesopotamian and the Sumerian texts and got all the way into cuneiform to find the core of most of our languages, most of our written languages. That's the core that most of them came out of, was the cuneiform text. You find that what takes a chapter or two to explain things in the Bible, it took hundreds of thousands of years. You read how it falls right into and how they took that, and just about every written language has a core in that. So I got into that, and I found out a whole lot more what's really going on. And they talked about hybridization. The fallen ones in the Bible are I call them aliens that came down, and they were Anunnaki. They crossbred with the indigenous people and created what ended up in several different trial periods, I think, us. It says, let us make man in our image, and then you get into cuneiform text where they talk about, there was like 12 Elohim. Elohim in the cuneiform text is God, always talked about in singular, but there was actually 12 of them. But there was an innumerable amount of Anunnaki, some good, some bad, and they were doing what they shouldn't have done, which was come down here and interfere with us. But that's where the Sumerians got their kicking up rear to give us all the knowledge that we have today. Most of it. I don't think they was into computers that much.
Speaking of high strangeness and some of the weird things that you've described that you guys were experiencing up there, the strange lights and some of the other things that were going on, something that people have talked about many times on the show. I've had Les Stroud, Survivor Man, on the show, has talked about having what he believes to be a telepathic connection to Sasquatch. Interestingly enough, I had an interview recently with a gentleman. He was talking about this new podcast that came out a couple of years ago called the Telepathy Tapes.
Yes.
In a nutshell, a couple of doctors and this lady who does this podcast has looked into nonverbal autistic children and young adults, and they have proven that they have telepathic abilities. They communicate telepathically with each other. A lot of times it's a connection with a parent. And I used to laugh at that theory. Chris Noel is one of those people who have talked about, written books about possibly Sasquatch being some sort of savant or having some sort of autism and being able to have that telepathic connection with each other and with human beings. Did you guys ever experience anything that you would even attribute to being close to a telepathic communication up there?
We were all very analytical. I think everybody has the ability. Everybody has the ability to do that. I think sometimes you might sense that someone's going to call you and the phone rings and that person calls. I think we just need to exercise our intuitiveness, which is another thing you do when you meditate. I think it's all goes back into frequency. You find the frequency, and a lot of people, I've heard people tell me about the telepathic things going on with them. Maybe that's what they were trying to tell me that night, is relax my brain a little bit. Maybe I could understand what they're saying. I don't know. That's a funny way to look at it. Well, yeah, telepathy is something that I think we all have in our genes. We have that ability if we just learn how to clean up ourselves. That means going into the pineal gland, which is in here, which is a receptor, in my opinion, the receptor of the source, whatever that is. It has direct connection to your heart, which has its own brain, by the way. Most people don't understand that yet, but it does. That has to be in coherence with the upstairs, what's going on above your shoulders. Because we've all been conditioned. The conditioning is all you got to go by. It's what you learn from. Whether it's your language or your culture or whatever it is, we're all conditioned. So the strangeness up there, it's another story. It falls into quantum science, I believe. But telepathically, they have that ability to do anything with their frequency. If you're on the right frequency, they work with you, I think. They do a lot of that people at night when it's dark, because I think the frequency of the earth drops to our frequency at night. Things happen when you get in that era, and it's easier for them to communicate with people who are in their relaxed state. Not that you're asleep. A lot of things happen when you do go to sleep. People think it's just a dream or something, but maybe it's a little bit more than that.
You mentioned the footprints and what was left behind that you guys found. How often did you find these footprints? It's one of those things that has been a little bit of a contested moment about some of the things that happened. I know Grover Krantz had some things to say about those, and Meldrum has had his opinion on the footprints. Can you describe those? You mentioned them being a little different than Patty's prints, for example. Can you describe where you were finding them, how you guys found them? What did they look like physically?
Yeah, they were bigger, for one thing. There were small ones. We had some 9-inch ones, along with an 18-inch one in the snow. That told us it was an adolescent. Of course, we had heard an adolescent too. One night in 74, I actually recorded it. That's why I think it was an adolescent and a mother down there. I think adolescents are getting a little bit bold around humans. Or maybe they're teaching them something, I don't know. But the tracks up there were 5-toed, all of them. They had a very little arch to them. They walked one print in front of the other. I wouldn't expect Krantz, who's passed away now, or Meldrum, either one, to acknowledge them. I never let them have a track to check, because I didn't know Krantz. He lived in Squim, where I used to live. He wouldn't even talk to us about it. He had a closed mind because they're all conditioned in a parameters of classical science. If it doesn't follow the rules, they won't get off that box. I hate to say that, but Jeff, I know Jeff pretty well. I've been on with him a lot of times. I'm over in Russia with him, actually, in Siberia. And he won't even talk to you about quantum science. I asked him about it then. That was 2011. I'd been into it then, trying to figure out something, because you got to be with science when you get with this stuff, or people aren't going to buy it. There have to be some kind of professor behind it, PhD. That's why these guys get the attention, because they got the PhD. I'm a citizen PhD, okay? And I've looked into it, and I think it answers a lot of the questions I had. The tracks, we looked for them. You only find what you look for. If you're not careful, you walk right by them. We look for the toes mainly, then you find out the trackway, if there is one. They're not easy, because we had decomposed for granted up there a lot of times in a lot of the areas around our shelter. As we're sometimes, if you hear the sounds right outside there, you know there's got to be a track somewhere. So you'd find them out there, and we'd cast them, and I've cast them, and I've got the cast. I got an original track cast, but people like Jeff Meldrum, they're going to compare it to the Patterson track, see if it's got everything Patterson track has. If it doesn't, it's considered a fake or not real or something else. I know Jeff, he's a good gentleman, a good, nice man, but he has to stay within his parameters. I understand that, so I don't begrudge him at all, but there's no upside to us giving him our tracks. I know what we dealt with up there. I don't have to prove it by a track. But if anybody wants a question about that, that's my answer. They're going to compare it to what they know, what they feel like they know is a Bigfoot track, and that's the Patterson track. Because there was a film with it, right? As many times as we tried to get a picture, we never got a picture.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I have dealt with. I have cast prints on my property in North Carolina. We've done entire shows on one of my other podcasts about gatekeeping in the Bigfoot community. There is gatekeeping to an extent when it comes to evidence, because people were asking me, as soon as I put those tracks out and I cast them and allowed people to see them, they're like, has it been validated by Jeff Meldrum or Cliff Barrickman? I know Jeff and Cliff both. Yes, I was going to send it to them, but at that moment, it really made me think about all the evidence. the Sierra sounds, the tracks from there, my tracks, my prints, my audio I've recorded, was, are we putting too much stock in one or two opinions because they are just comparing it with what's already been known, quote unquote known, and then they're sticking to their paradigm. And if they're not looking outside of that and willing to be more open-minded about differences in your tracks or my tracks or Patty's tracks, are we doing a disservice to some of the evidence? In my opinion, I think we are. I think it's important. I have great respect for Jeff. I have great respect for Cliff. But at the same time, they've been wrong. Let's just be honest. They've been wrong about certain trackways that ended up being hoaxes, and they were 100% on board with them being real. So if they made a mistake then, could they make a mistake now? So I think we have to be very careful, in my opinion, as a community, on gatekeeping and looking at evidence with an open mind.
I agree with you 100%. That's very important. And that's what my goal is at my age. I'm in my 80s now. I just want to bring classical science and quantum science together because they won't get out of their box. And I believe that's what they're in. They're in a conditioned paradigm, and that they won't get out of that. I think if one of them wants to come in and start talking to them, they'd still say that they don't. It might make a difference to some people, but I've been around these things. I've seen some of the stuff they do, and there's no answer for it in classical science, and that's where they're at. It's a shame that they have to degrade things that don't meet up with their paradigm. I know they do that, and that's okay with me. It's truth will prevail. That's my favorite saying. Whatever's truth will come out sooner or later. They're not all the same. I believe I got way back into beings from the cosmos coming here eons ago. That's what I write about in my last book. It's just that there's been a lot of hybridization programs going on here. There's a lot of things going on by advanced beings. They have been here. They are here now. Why they don't expose themselves is because we're in a place where we're supposed to live out our karma. We're supposed to know. We're supposed to learn from our experiences. That's why we're here. That's teaching everything, because nothing else has what we have as humans. We're made into images of a very special, very high frequential being. If we learn from that, then that's what our life's about. And we will die. If you don't learn, you got to learn it. Got to come back and learn it. I'm sorry. I wasn't raised this way to believe in multiple embodiments, but I do now, because you got to learn. And if you don't learn, how you learn from what it's like, what's really we're supposed to be like. You have to learn with love and compassion with everybody else. You can't go out there hurting people or live in a victim paradigm yourself. You have to just learn to care. We're in a warring species, and that's because of the Anunnaki, the ones that fell. They've created the wars. Get into Greek mythology, you're going to get into wars between the gods. They were all had different names. They all had special abilities. They were called the powerful ones from the sky. You get into that and you realize just what all went on. We're here to expand and to learn. Once we've learned to love and compassion with our human compadres out there, we will step ahead, and our vibration will get higher, because we got to get out of this third dimension. That's our goal.
Let's go back a little bit to what you guys were experiencing up there when you were making these recordings. Did you ever notice any difference in the vocalization patterns based on any kind of environmental factors like the weather, the moon phases? Were you more successful in one season versus the other with the activity?
We couldn't get up there in the wintertime, number one. Just too much snow load. The roads are closed off anyway to get you close to it. And if you want to get close to it, you couldn't get up that high. Anyway, we wouldn't go until springtime when we knew the snow was melted down far enough where we could make the trail in without getting hurt too bad. I've had a few broken ribs on the trail. My horse went off the edge. But our biggest time was during deer hunting season, but that might have been because we was up there. It might have been because they didn't want to go around other camps that they didn't trust. There was no other camps real close to us. There was one that wasn't too far away from us, but it was never inhabited. In fact, we raided it. We always looked there to see if anybody used it. No one's used it. All the time I was growing up there from the 70s. We checked around to see if there's anybody else running around up there, and there wasn't. That was when we first started. But there was a hunting camp, and that's what the guys went up there for. They said to come around at night during hunting season and actually move our deer. We'd hang them up and skin them, let them air out behind the shelter there on a cable. They'd come up and they actually moved it. We found some tracks there one time, moving our deer. Larry, Warren's son, who was 10 years my junior, him and I were there at the stove one night, and we thought, let's go back there and clean up around the deer so if one comes in again, we can get tracks. Sure enough, that happened. There was 3 tracks there underneath this deer, and the deer had been moved. those 3 tracks you could have seen over our shelter down to where we were sitting. So one was watching us when that was going on. We went back there, found the tracks, and wow, that's an eye-opener. I think these things are spying on you. They know what you're doing. And we had no idea they could figure out what we was doing, but like the camera traps we set up, can't believe they knew what a camera was at the time. So we thought, we'll trick them. You ain't going to trick these things. They see your vibration. They see your intent. They see your motives. They see right through that. And they have these abilities that we haven't learned to evolve into yet, in my opinion.
Did you see a difference in the way they were communicating with you, for lack of a better term, when you started communicating back or trying to elicit a response? And if so, what kind of differences in the communication did you see?
A lot of difference between 71, 72, and the one I recorded from 74. The cryptolinguists, because they just sound different. I asked him, is that the same bunch of creatures or something different? Because they sounded a little different. He said it sounds the same vocal mechanism did the sounds from both ears. He says he thinks they slowed their vocalizations down to possibly something I could understand. They talk real fast, very fast chatter, very much like John Green in his Apes Among Us from his interview with Albert Ostman, which I've been up there looking for Albert Ostman where he was taken. Flew up there in my airplane and flew around for a whole day, slow flying, looking for that. Landed at Camel River, went over there to where he said he was. And I write about that in my second book, Albert Ostman story. Anyway, from 71, 72, 74, because 71, 72 was very intimidating. And it sounded like, well, found out, at least I think they were arguing amongst themselves, not directed at. We didn't know at first if they were. That's what scared Donald off at first, because he's afraid they was arguing about who's going to put the salt and pepper on us. But everybody's heavily armed, I got to tell you that. We never went up there without some kind of a self-protection. But a lot of that wasn't to protect us from these things as much as we thought it might be at the beginning. But 71, 72, the aggressive sounds were chest beating, very much a big gorilla would do or something that you're thinking. It was a little spooky, I got to tell you that, because you still didn't know. You don't know. To this day, we don't know. We do know that in 74, they were more subtle. They were trying to say something to me, and I don't to this day know what it was, because until you get one to come in and start talking to you, you don't know that ooga ooga means a tree. You don't know what that means. You know it's a language, though, by the human definition of language, and that's important. They were talking slower. I don't know what they were saying, but I'd try to mimic them all. That was exciting. That was why we're outside the shelter, which is unusual. Very unusual.
You mentioned that you thought, or you guys thought, that there might be juveniles and some older adults, maybe possibly a female. Could you differentiate between what you guys thought was the juvenile? And if so, what was the difference in the type of vocalizations from the adults versus the juvenile?
Yeah. You can hear that on my sounds that come in my first book. I got a link in that book where you can hear the sound when I get to the context. Yeah, you can definitely hear the difference. It's a smaller voice. You just know it's smaller. Then you hear the bigger voice come down on, don't do that or something like that. Then you hear the male voice, big one. You can tell the difference in their aptitude. At least we could tell. I could tell the difference. So could the other guys pretty much. Sometimes you hear the old man, they call him. That one, I don't know how big he was, but we found some tracks up on the ridge one time when we was meeting up from a hunt, and found these tracks coming off these boulders down into this sandy area and then off into the brush. Found 4 big tracks that were 25.5 inches, and that's pretty big. And I got pictures of that. There's 13 foot between them. It wasn't running. So that'd throw you a loop. I didn't show that one or talk about it for a long time, but nowadays at my age, I don't care. I just want to share things that I think I know and hope it helps somebody else.
Here's a question from the audience that people have asked a couple of times, and I wanted to get it directly from you. Have you ever worked with anybody outside of Scott Nelson as far as a linguist or somebody else who could look at these and make some determinations? And here was the second part of that question, and this is something that I think Meldrum actually mentioned recently on an interview I saw him do, was he had asked, I don't know if he had talked to you about it or if he had talked to Scott about putting Scott's work together in a paper for peer review and letting other people take a look at these. That's a 2-part question. Has anybody, another linguist or somebody along the line of Scott Nelson, looked at these things? And is Scott even considering possibly putting his stuff into a paper for peer review? And if not, do you have any idea why?
I certainly do. Yeah, Melder's talked to Scott. I've talked to Scott. Scott's writing this up. In fact, he's putting it in now to hopefully do something like that soon. Scott's laid back, though. He's retired now. He's not a Bigfoot person. People want to send me a yell or something like that to send to Scott to see if it's a Bigfoot. Scott doesn't do that. He looks for language. He's a language person. He's a cryptolinguist, though. That is an art form. It's not like a regular linguist. So I've had people contact me. These things are open for anybody who wants to investigate them. They always have been. But I want to make sure they're qualified. If they try to put it into some other category in their paradigm, it's not going to work. And at least in my opinion, they got to get all the way back into manipulation of the DNA of hominids and how much that happens. I think the whole Earth is just a big playground for aliens. And I got called on the carpet here a few days ago about somebody saying they were phony, the sounds were phony, because they heard a reverb or something in there, or they thought they did, but I don't know who did that or whatever, but they can't disprove what PhDs have proven. So far they haven't, and yes, I've had different linguists, different people say they're linguists, but again, it's comparing apples with oranges. A regular linguist isn't qualified to do what Scott Nelson does. There's only one or two people in the world that Scott says he would trust to really look into this like he has. And they're retired like he is. But there's probably others out there somewhere, but no one ever approaches me with that offer that says they're cryptolinguist. Cryptolinguist is an art form, not treated the same as regular linguist. So to put it in peer review, Scott don't trust him. He wrote a letter to Josh Melton, a very nice letter, because he won't subject his work to somebody that don't know what they're doing.
Some researchers have suggested that the Sierra Sounds might contain infrasound, or at least elements of infrasound. When you guys were up there, did you ever have any physical effects like vibrations, dizziness, or an overwhelming fear that might be associated with infrasound?
Yes, absolutely. I've had that happen to me twice up there. Don't know what it was. Might have been infrasound, but I have no doubt that they can go into infrasound and ultrasound both. I say I have no doubts, but our cassette recorders didn't record those things. Scientists that recorded infrasound and ultrasound, but the big animals use those. Elephants, giraffes, tigers. They communicate a lot in infrasound. And Warren Johnson and I were in shelter when one of these things was mouthing off up there, and we were feeling pretty good about it then. We didn't think they could eat us anymore. We left the shelter door open, which was just a log between two big trees on an angle, and we thought, we'll go out there right quick and walk up there. We'll see this thing run away, because we want to get a good view of one. But we did just that. We jumped out of the door real quick, fast as we could get out, and started walking up to where the sounds were coming from, which wasn't that far away. And we got within about 15 feet of that tree we thought it was behind, and him and I both just got froze. We weren't talking to each other, and we were about 10, 15 feet apart. We were just, I don't know how to express it other than I write about that, and it's like a force field. You can't go forward anymore. And Warren looked at me and said, I don't know about you, but I can't move. And I said, I can't either. And we started going backwards, and we go backwards, we couldn't go forward. I brought that up to Leroy Fish. He was a biologist. He was a scientist. He's deceased now, a good man. But science can't take on your fears. And I said, we were not afraid. Believe me, we were not afraid. We realized these things aren't here to hurt us, or they would have already done it. If they were here to carry us away in a sleeping bag, they'd have carried us away. If they wanted to eat us, they could have eaten us. If they wanted to throw a rock at us, they could have done that. When we got back in, we no sooner got back in the shelter, and this thing started mouth off again, like it was, ha-ha, fooled us, which they can. They play with you like that. And I had it happen to me again when I was alone out in the woods. I was walking along, not thinking about it at all, and all of a sudden, the hair stood up on my back. I just was froze right there, and I started looking around, what's going on here? And I couldn't see a source of anything. And of course, I didn't know about Dr. Dirac's antimatter at the time either, because I think they can send out a frequency to you that can stun you like that. I've heard a lot of people say the same thing.
All right, this comes from listener Bud. He wanted you to talk about, it was funny, he said, ask him about Bigfoot and energy, the quantum theory. I read his book, but I still don't understand it. Uh-huh. Could you go a little bit more into that, and also talk a little bit about, you've mentioned a couple of times about them possibly having two sets of vocal cords. So can you talk a little bit about the Bigfoot, energy, quantum theory, and then possibly something along the lines of the two vocal cords?
Sure. We've been hitting on that during this whole program a little bit, but everything is energy, frequency, and vibration. You take us down to the most minute level of the atom, we are. That's not the most reliable, but it get all the way down to who we are. We're energy vibrating at a frequency. And if you can find the frequency, you can change matter. And that's established. I think I talked about that a little earlier. Go back and listen to it. But that's who we are. And that's who we're made to be. But we have not evolved in understanding that yet. These are mathematical facts that can't be disproven, or they would have disproven them mathematically. That's what Paul Dirac got the Nobel Prize for. We have two sets, supposedly. I've heard on a podcast I was on years ago, a medium, I said, I need to talk to this guy after this is over with. I talked to him and I said, what's going on? How do they do what they do with their vocal? He says, I don't know that. He knows that until you get one, you don't know. But that's what gives them such a frequency diversity. Things that we can't do, they can do with their vocal mechanism. If that leads into antimatter, if that leads into the frequency that can change their matter, who they are, and that's what we all are, to energy only, they go out of our perception. And that's my theory. Sticking to it.
All right. This is a little off topic, but this comes up quite a bit about the Bigfoot 911 call that everybody uses. I've used it in the intro from my show for years. Tons of other podcasts use that famous Bigfoot 911 call. This actually comes from Brent, and he asked the question, can you talk a little bit about that 911 call? Because apparently people have done some FOIA requests and they've tried to find it, and there doesn't seem to be a record of the call. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you got to interview that gentleman. He's even asking if there was a specific police report number that was taken for the call that maybe somebody could go back and reference. But in general, the FOIA request turned up nothing on the 911 call, but you actually got to talk to this gentleman. Can you talk a little bit about that for people that may not be familiar with it?
He was retired Navy, and he had a Vietnam vet. He'd working in his garage, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, his sensor light went off out of his garage. He had this glass or plastic lights out there so you could see through his garage at a certain height. He saw this thing. Now, 2 weeks prior to that, something scared him out there. It was his big German Shepherd dog, who never went out, just stayed there. He had 2 younger dogs, aggressive dogs, go out and bark. That night, 2 weeks later, when he saw it, actually, his German Shepherd went out. His 2 other dogs came in and cowered down right there. The German Shepherd went out there and started barking at something. All of a sudden, he heard a big thunk and a squeal. It came flying over the fence and landed, I think 35 feet away from the fence. He showed us where it went over the fence. It had to be thrown 9 foot high. And we went over there, Peter Byrne and I did, looking for tracks, looking for anything that could have done that, a horse or something like that could have kicked him. But he had a sighting. You can't hardly deny that when you hear that. Peter contacted the service department because he said after the sighting that he saw it run away across the old dirt road there, and a car had gone by, and the car actually went off a little bit to miss it. Peter had even put an ad in the paper trying to find anybody to see nothing unusual that night on that road and didn't get any response from it. Peter would have had the number of that report from the sheriff's department there. This is in Kitsap County, up in the peninsula up there. I'm sure there's a number somewhere. I just don't have it. I edited it. I took out the typing and all that stuff that was in between the reports, because there's 2 reports, one 2 weeks later than the other one. 2 weeks later was when he had the sighting. That's when he said, oh, get somebody here. He's afraid to say Bigfoot because he knows they may have laughed it off or something, probably wouldn't have came out. 2 weeks prior to that is when I knew something was going on. He called him in. So he had a man take the report then, and then a lady took the report 2 weeks later. That's the story behind it. I didn't leave I've had people trying to get a hold of me to find his name and all that, but he don't respond to his phone anymore. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know. I don't even know if he lives there anymore, because something like that goes on. Generally, you and your wife want to move away.
I guess it was last year, maybe sometime, I heard you and Todd Neese were over on Pine Island Research with Jeff doing a podcast. And Todd just threw it out there and said, hey, Ron, you remember that time me and you and Peter Byrne were down in the 90s doing this, and you brought the shoebox full of all the Sierra sounds that haven't been released? And I was like, whoa, wait, what? And Jeff actually reached out to me and was like, dude, did you hear them talking? There's more Sierra sounds that we've never heard. So I started talking about it on my podcast, and we've talked about it, done some interviews with other people and talked about it, and we've done other shows about it, Wayne and I, on that Bigfoot podcast. So I reached out to you and got this conversation going about that. You've obviously talked about it with me privately. So can we talk a little bit about what you have as far as the unreleased sounds, how many they are, and what exactly is in there, and why it is that you've chosen not to release those after all these years?
We have released the very best recordings. We have others that are good, but we have redundancy. But what's very important to me right now is there's a documentary being made on the Sierra camp by a production company. And I don't want to interfere with what they're doing because they're going to emphasize these, because they also got the recordings from Warren Johnson's archive, which he's passed away years ago. They're going to release those in the documentary, which would be probably about an hour and a half long. They're doing a really good job. They've been working on this for a couple of years. Whatever, I don't want to interfere with their work. They're very good people. They're going to do a good job. I've known them now for a while. So I hope that people aren't offended. It's all chatter that you don't understand. Well, I've listened to them all. We have hours of it, really. I have Bill McDowell's recordings, and the production company has Warren Johnson's recordings. So they're going to try to get all this together. All the silence, I've been asked several times about this. So I'll give you one or two, I think, and you're welcome to play those, because we ran them through the production people that are doing this, and they said it's okay, because really none of them sound much different. It's just chatter, but they talk so much faster than us. There's a lot of space and time between a lot of them, too, which I mentioned to you, which has our voices back in the shelter. It's just very important that we don't interfere with them. To me, it's important, and to them. They spent a lot of money on this, and they're still spending money on it. They're in the editing phase, I think, now. But we can play those if you want to.
I had a conversation with Jill via email after you and I had talked, and you expressed some concerns about that. And she said, what we're doing is not going to interfere with that at all. So we're pressing forward with that for sure. I guess the last question here, related to the sounds is just looking back on your years of research, everything you did at the Sierra camp, everything you've done since. Is there anything that you know now that would cause you to do things differently back then? Or is there anything about the whole situation that still keeps you up at night?
Nothing keeps me up at night. Not anymore. I'm not surprised at anything that happens because you get into quantum theory and you realize that anything can happen. No, I think I would have done things differently. I would have not underestimated. None of us would. We underestimate them thinking they're just an ape in the woods running around. They got to document it some way. So you go out and cast tracks, you go out and try to record, you go out and try to trick them, you do all that stuff. But they're a step ahead of you. At least what we dealt with was a step ahead of us. And I've been to other places too where it's a phenomenal history back here. I'm writing my biography now, and just the places I've been, the things I've seen are pretty interesting to me. It'll be interesting to anybody else or not, but I think my message to people, if I have a message, is to know who you are as a human being and how special we are as a human being, what we're here for. It's written in my third book. I've written 3 books and produced 2 CDs about the sounds narrated, one by me and one by Jonathan Frakes, Star Trek Next Generation. They're both about 40 minutes long with integrated sounds in them. They're both downloadable on my website. Also, my books are downloadable on my website. Or you can get the hard copy through Amazon, which is ordered through my website again. It's just to know that we have to respond with love and compassion. That's what's going to elevate us as human beings.
Very wise words. I will link to all that in the show notes for you guys to go over and get the books, check out the sounds. Ron, I can't thank you enough for inviting me into your home. I've had a blast talking to you.
Thank you. It was good. Good questions.